Welcome to the first in a new series on shaping agility. We are deconstructing PI planning. This is episode number 1. And on the chat today, we've got myself, Mark, we've got Stephan, Nick, and Yuval Yeret, or Yeret. I'm probably pronouncing it horrendously wrong.
So far, fine.
This is a stream series that started based on a conversation thread that Yuval began on our Discord channel about deconstructing PI planning, probably triggered a little bit by a recent LinkedIn post by Ken Klein about PI planning, why it's good, why sometimes it's not good. And Yuval's worried that if he spoke truly honestly about some of his feelings, he might get disbarred as an SPCT. But if there's one thing we love, it's playing on the edges. So I thought to kick us off, and there'll be a whole bunch of these series, because as soon as we started talking, we went, let's talk about this, let's talk about that. Today's just going to be the first hour or so of that chat. So throwing it around, Yuval or Stephan, if you thought about PI planning, your exposure to and experience with it since you started your SAFE journey, if you went, love it, hate it, love it sometimes, hate it sometimes, what's your kind of high-level summary?
I can start. Maybe a metaphor, the TLDR version might be, it's kind of very similar to my sentiment towards Scrum and Kanban. Scrum can provide a lot of needed structure and batching and cadence to teams and organizations that are struggling in chaos, and to bring teams together. At a certain point in time or in certain situations, Scrum is, not agile enough, some people would say. So I've been, in this position years ago that, a lot of the problems, both from a change management perspective as well as what's actually the post-agile world, are solved better with Kanban. But I then realized that there's a need for a balancing the force, you could say, between the cadence and the thinking and the flow of Kanban. And I think it's similar in PI planning. PI planning can bring teams together, provide structure in chaos, create alignment, but it's also a slippery slope. And if people with the wrong mindset do it, with a missing understanding of the intent and the principles behind it, it can become just a classic project management work breakdown activity where all you do is bean count points and stories and focus on your own things rather than really align. And it becomes more about activity and output and outcomes and alignment. It sets you up for following a plan rather than responding to change if you do it the wrong way.
Yep. Stephan, over to you.
It's interesting. Almost similar thoughts like Yuval, but still, let me start in a positive way. I get glowing eyes when I see PI planning, when I experience PI planning, because something happens in enterprise, right? And as you mentioned, Yuval, it's kind of this alignment, this transparency you create when you start PI plannings in an enterprise. It's awesome. I like it. But, and there's the big but, and let me just bring in, one of the provocative statements. What if we wouldn't have a PI planning? If we had a constant mind of doing PI planning and not creating large queues? Because we are preparing an 8 to 12 week backlog, which is not kind of conceived or perceived like a backbone. It's more like, this is now the backlog, it's output, and suddenly or immediately you deviate away from what PI planning, in my opinion, should be. You should have real good conversation. What is a target picture? What's the big intent? How do those lakes look like? Those faces? How can we have constructive conflict and learning together, and not just having a coercive agenda over 2 days? And over the time, just people show up and say, "Hey, we are prepared. Why do we have to stay for 2 days? Here's the plan. Can we go back to work?" That's my background.
I'm
How about you,
sensing,
Mark?
I'm sensing a common theme here. So when I was part of what became probably one of the first case studies to be published after SAFE became SAFE, we never did PI planning. And it was a bit of a running joke between us and Dean, because he'd say, if you're not doing PI planning, you're not doing SAFE. We had a very well-known case study, and we never did PI planning. Now, we didn't do it for some very good reasons. We set out to do it, and we couldn't. So I'd run SAFE for 2 years before I ever saw a PI planning. I taught a lot of leading SAFEs. I had drunk the Kool-Aid, and I went, "Oh, PI planning sounds awesome." The first time I saw it, I went, "Oh, wow, it really is awesome." But then over the years, I love it when the context is right. I hate it when it's misused, done poorly, or done in the wrong context. And I also hate it when it doesn't evolve as the context evolves. It is a great starting recipe, providing you've got the conditions in place for it to be the right starting recipe. And I have repeatedly caused a great deal of shock at some of the SPCT gatherings when I look around the room and I go, success with SAFE probably means you're not doing PI planning anymore because you don't need it. And people look
Exactly.
at me and go, heresy, what are you saying? And, in some contexts, they turn around and they say, we're building aircraft carriers and we're never going to get rid of it. So, okay, fair enough.
Yeah. It's like when I say success with SAFE is you don't need the solution train.
Yeah, well, that's another
Or an agile train.
that's another whole topic. And yeah,
Yeah,
agree.
not today. But I think it kind of relates. I think if your agile release train is set up effectively, you don't need PI planning that much, or your PI planning can be much more streamlined, much less intense and complex.
If I may hook in here, Yuval, I'm less and less talking about solution trains, because people think that is another configuration, a building where you bring together all the people. And for me, it's more like, how do you scale up business context, business ownership, bringing in the leadership intent? Because at the end, it's the teams knowing what to do, bringing in all the collaboration work, coordinating, and then using some of those means we have in PI planning, which are really helpful. But it's sometimes, as you both mentioned, it might be overstructured, highly structured, and people follow it in a slavish way. And that's not what I would like to see. And that's not, as you mentioned, Mark, the evolution of a PI planning. If you come back to a train after the 10th PI planning or the 10th PI, if you don't see any change, you know what happened in the past 2.5 years, right?
So I'm going to come with one caveat on all of this. And I think it's the piece that in many ways gave rise to the notion of essential safe, which is a lot of people think it's optional in a context where it's really not. And there are people who have tried to do safe at a given level of maturity where, it's never going to work for them without PI planning. And they've looked down the list and said, oh, no, PI planning, too expensive, can't justify it, not doing it. And it's fundamentally compromised them. And it's very risky to be using safe and choose not to do PI planning unless you've got the level of scaled lean agile maturity to be making a really mindful decision.
I would put it differently. Or my take is, and I go back to my Kanban, Scrum, years of doing just Kanban without any cadence, let's say. I think PI planning, some level of planning your PI is crucial. What happens there, I think it's ripe for a revolution, evolution, whatever. I think some level of PI planning is even useful when you're just one team and don't have any dependencies with others. And I'm doing that with some organizations. But the history is PI planning was release planning, was something that helped us get from scope driven to capacity and time driven and provide forecasting. It's not just about the alignment with other teams, it's also alignment with your business and stakeholders. So a lot of that, I rarely see an environment where it's not relevant. Whether it is we just align on our outcomes through OKRs, or do we actually dive into story level? Those are all options, panic palette options that, hopefully over time we could play with.
So if you stick in that Scrum Kanban metaphor, because I actually find that a really useful metaphor at that next level of scale. And Eric put it much more eloquently than me in one of our recent chats, but here's my simple version. I would argue Scrum is easier to start with because it has some hard rules, but those rules eventually become limits. Kanban is harder to start with because it has less rules and requires more self-discipline, but eventually has far less limits, arguably no limits. And so 80% of the time, a new agile team, I'll say start with Scrum. But then I'll say every good Scrum team eventually evolves to be a Kanban team because the Scrum rule set has provided some forcing functions to drive a certain level of evolution. And there's usually a pretty obvious trigger point to me. They come and they say, Mark, these sprint cadences are driving batching behavior. Right, now it's time to get rid of that constraint. And I think the same thing for a lot of the kind of essential safe constructs, of which PI planning is one of them. It provides some hard rules and some forcing functions to begin a change. But then as that change comes into motion, it's important to start to recognize the moment where you probably need some less of those hard rules. And you can start to peel away the surroundings.
To bring back the Kanban and Scrum metaphor, in Kanban is also a change method, right?
Yep.
And the fact that it is easier to start with means that there are some organizational contexts where the right move for an organization would be to actually start with a feature Kanban board.
Yep.
With, managing the continuous delivery pipeline, however it's working right now, and over time build the buy-in, the need, the build up to the sort of cadence that PI planning provides. Maybe even start with PI planning that doesn't involve everybody. Heresy, right? At the beginning, from a change management perspective, that that might be a way to start and build the gap. People would realize, oh, we missed some things because not everybody was there. Okay, there's a cost to that. There's a cost of not doing that. What's the right economic move? Do we actually buy into bringing everybody here, and not just because Yuval said so or Stephan said so?
So just probing that a second, and I wonder whether, because PI planning is so intrinsically linked to the concept of an agile release train, right? Is that decision making less about whether or not PI planning is the right answer at a given point in time, and more about the question of whether or not an agile release train is the right answer at a given point in time.
May I address this question a little bit differently, right? Well, what I'm doing now in a department of infrastructure and services, which is part of a global IT, the first question the guys had, do we have to attend PI planning? And I said, no. My question to you guys is, who has to work together? Who has a system of work, not only a Kanban system, because they have Kanban systems. And I said, that's only a means, but around that Kanban system, who is standing in front of that Kanban system every 2 days, every week, every month? And then we started sketching. We didn't talk about PI planning. We didn't talk about an agile release train or a team of agile teams. We talked about a working system. And then all of a sudden, they opened up the perspective and said, oh, we have connections within the department to other teams, but they don't belong to our kind of entity. And we have connections outside the company or outside the department within the company. And all of a sudden, we started sketching like a work system topology. Without using that word, we had a sketch, and then I tried to say, okay, now let's play like kids with the demand. How does the demand now flow through that system you sketched? And all of a sudden, they said, oh, there's dependencies, there's some risks, there's some entry and exit points and some delays we can already anticipate. And I said, okay, guys, let's put it together. And then we came back to what could be a structural or could be a structure of an PI planning. And we were pretty close to what the normal PI planning agenda is. But now, going back to Yuval, we are not calling it the first PI planning. It's just the first gathering to create a working system that really interacts and has some benefits. And those guys are looking forward now to, what should we know? What should we be trained in? How should we adapt our Kanban system? Stuff like that.
So while I sit and nod and go, that's awesome, I'm going to come back to my question, which is really, are you choosing a train or not? In terms of PI planning in the early days, it doesn't sound to me like you're building a train. It sounds to me like you're evolving a system of work.
Yes, because they said, oh, we are not a typical train. And I had to tell them, yes, you're right. But still, you are probably having some attributes of an agile release train. And if you struggle with the term agile release train, let's not talk about it. Let's talk about what really is the challenge, what is the job to be done, so that we can serve other existing agile release trains. And that's how we started sketching that work system topology.
Maybe this is a good time to talk about the fact that the agile release train is a horrible name these days, at least in my.
Yeah, and
I mean, it's not about releases. And I'm working with a very similar group to the group you're talking about, Stephan, almost like a mirror copy.
Yeah.
And they definitely don't release together. But there is a question, like you're describing, of do they even need to work together? Let's say a group working on ServiceNow for global IT.
Yeah.
Yep.
Multiple teams, each working with a different business function on what they need from ServiceNow. Do they really need those dependencies? And sometimes it feels like one of those, PI planning simulations, which actually don't simulate any dependencies, where it feels like it's somewhat a waste of time for them to be doing this together. But on the other end, once you wait patiently to kind of see some things that are happening, you start to notice that sometimes it would make sense for them to look at demand from a shared perspective. Sometimes there's one business function that really needs much more. And, through the fact that they created teams working with each one of the functions, if they were in a silo, it would be a local optimum. And to apply system view, you actually need them to do something together. Is that something classic PI planning? Probably not, but it does make sense for them to be a team of teams. Is it an agile release train? Maybe, maybe not, but it does make sense for them to think of themselves as one development value stream.
May I broaden a little bit that field of items we are now touching, right? If I look at the implementation roadmap, we're talking about organize around value stream identification, very valuable, but I still don't follow the typical value stream identification. If I go in there, I first ask what's the biggest challenge, or where are the biggest issues you have in your organization. If you find out where you want to tackle, then you might be able to prepare agile teams or how they start collaborating, stuff like that. But what I experienced over and over again in those first PI plannings or the preparation phase, people started to forget they already had some working systems they should interact with. And one of the workshops I did recently was I gave all the teams just a generic Kanban board, like there's a funnel, you have to analyze, you have to define, you have to build it, you have to deliver it, right? What are your connections? Where do you need support? Where could you anticipate that if something comes in as a demand, you should probably evolve your system and even your process, right? So for me, if we talk about agile release train or a team of agile teams or a collaboration of agile teams and non-agile teams, do we really include everyone? And then we decide what we need as means, if we need a PI planning as is, or if we need an adapted agenda or an adapted structure, or even an extended structure if needed, including the preparation phase, right?
So I'm going to jump on that. And I've just realized my chat plugin for my OBS isn't working, but we have a question from a chatter. And the question is, and it follows on from your thread, Stephan, if the red string doesn't reduce per quarter, then is PI planning just becoming a fixed operational overhead? And my belief is yes.
Mhm.
In actual fact, if you think about it through an evolutionary perspective, I would argue your goal is to get rid of red string. And at the point in which you get rid of the red string, you most definitely do not need anything that still looks like a traditional PI planning. With the caveat that you don't get rid of the red string by chopping work up into widgets.
Yeah.
You get rid of this
Exactly.
red string by decoupling people's ability to pursue value.
Re-architecting the system or the teams or both.
Yeah, exactly. And
Agreed.
you've just gone
Yeah.
laggy. Now, what I do want to do, though, is pull us out of the rabbit hole, because we're really probably playing with two topics here now. One topic is when do you need a train, and the other is when or why do you need PI planning. And as a side note to your comment about the term agile release train, Yuval, I suspect that we're not alone in that thought, and I suspect inside the walls of SAI, they've probably had that thought, and we've seen them over the years try and pull legacy words out of the framework, but the art is just so endemic to it that the refactor required. But what I have noticed is that they don't talk about agile release trains much anymore. They talk about arts. It's like one step away. Let's talk about the art.
Yeah.
But I wonder whether we can agree, sort of coming back out to PI planning. And it's difficult, right? Because the two seem so intertwined. Can we agree to say in the beginning, and let's separate the when you begin from when you evolve. In the beginning, if you're not standing up something that looks like an art and the various bundled things that come with Essential Safe, it's probably a fair indicator that you might need, and you probably do need, some kind of mid-range planning event, but you probably don't need PI planning based on the traditional agenda.
So just to mirror, to make sure I heard you correctly, or the way I would put it is, if you identify the development value stream that's well served by a relatively coupled team of teams, art, that team of teams would benefit from some level of mid-range planning, PI planning. How exactly that looks is something I would love us to have further conversation on.
I'm sure we'll wind up there somewhere down the series. But yeah, I mean, and I think a single team needs mid-range planning.
Yep.
Right? Back in 2005, when I did my CSM with Mr. Schwaber, he said if you try and do any planning beyond the end of the sprint, you're failing at Scrum. But I think we've all recognized the pragmatic reality that you've got to do something a bit further range. And whatever form it takes, heavyweight, lightweight, full-blown PI planning, something much simpler, being able to look a little bit further ahead. And I like to me, it's mid-range, that 8 to 12 weeks, a quarter, as many people typically interpret it. Having a planning cycle that looks out roughly a quarter, that's tuned to your context, makes a lot of sense. But if what you're building structurally is an art, then arguably at the beginning, if you don't do PI planning with an art, I would argue you're heading for a world of pain.
If you're not doing any sort of PI planning, or if you're not doing PI planning as the canonical version of PI planning.
To me, something pretty close to the canonical. And the reason that I'd argue this is, if you think about, and you mentioned earlier, right, Kanban is an approach to change. I believe launching an art is an approach to change as well. And it's a more Scrum-like approach to change than a Kanban approach, because launching an art is most definitely a Kakaku event. But when you put a group of people together and launch an art, you are creating a swell of energy, vision, and change to resettle into a new way of working together. And the PI planning is really the beginning of that, or the quick start is the beginning of that moment that says we're now assembled in a new configuration, working together in a new way. Which doesn't preclude the idea that you might have worked for a period in a more gentle fashion before you hit that moment of transition, because you might have started and said, hey, look, we're going to test and learn. We're not going to commit to a full art and PI planning until we've got a certain way down the path of shaping. But that you're looking for that moment that says, actually, now stuff's different.
I guess the question I'm asking is, or the question we need to explore, I think, is what constitutes the minimum viable elements of PI planning. And I agree with you on everything that you currently said. That should be how you launch, part of how you launch an art. But a lot of what people actually do, and a lot of we actually train them if we follow canonical guidance, goes way beyond that. There's a way to achieve alignment, to energize people, to get them to form relationships that doesn't go all the way to creating a story-based work breakdown structure for the entire PI that people would feel is impeding their ability to be agile, in a sense.
Okay, let's open the minimum for PI planning, and I reckon it's time for us to switch to a little bit of Miro visualization. So if we've got to the notion that says, to get to here, we've said it's an art. We're not going to apply PI planning to a single team or to some group of teams who are not logically an art, despite the fact that they might be a team of teams. If we go, what's the minimum for PI planning? If I went a very, very beginning, I'd say it's got to be a real art. And that might be a gross oversimplification, but you've got to have constituted it with the minimum stuff that's actually going to make it work as an art, even though that might not be the full essential safe.
What are you thinking about? Like scaling roles,
So,
talking content, alignment, stuff like that?
do you have a clear, prioritized art backlog? Do you have product managers, an RTE? Do you have well-designed teams that are dedicated to that art, right? If you run down the essential safe checklist and you go, if you're not hitting a fair bit of that checklist, then you're not going to get what you need out of PI planning. I mean, I've seen PI planning in all of the trains I've launched over the years. I've seen PI planning fail twice. Right? One time it failed because they hadn't managed to staff up all the teams yet. We walked into the room with, I think, 12 people from the train, most of whom were Scrum Masters, product managers, and product owners. No team members and 100 guests. And it was a fiasco because they hadn't managed to meet minimum conditions.
I would agree on the minimum conditions. I'm more worried about success of PI planning and failure of the art, to be honest.
Hang on.
I've seen too many successful PI planning events. If you look at, have we done what PI planning should look like? But it sets you up for following a plan rather than responding to change. Not really assuming variability, not really preserving options, not really learning incrementally along the way. That's what I really fear. And when I think about all of the visuals in the PI planning article and in the way we teach it in Leading Safe, I don't have an issue with any of those. I think all of those make sense. The inputs are right. The outputs are mostly right. What happens inside PI planning, if I look at the agenda, I think the agenda is mostly right. I prefer to spend more time in breakouts and not half a day when just one person is talking. But, generally all of the items are there.
So let's say
My
as a given.
my thoughts are more around at what level do you plan?
All right. So let's say we know we all flex agenda timings, right? I don't know anybody who follows the agenda timings in the standard agenda, right? And in fact, when I pull it up in a training room, I say, this is Australia. Try and get a group of devs in a room at 8 a.m. Good luck to you. It's an easy beginning. Right. And we always go, let's try and get the speeches done by morning coffee break. Give us more time in breakout. So I think flexing timings on the agenda is just a gimme.
Yeah.
If I come back to your commentary around flexibility, Yuval, for me, actually, a lot of that flexibility question is not so much what SAFE recommends as to how many people misinterpret it. And that's my trigger for prepared and present business owners. Okay. So if you look at some of the things that just drive me crazy about the way people interpret PI planning, is that they think the stories are commitments, right? They think the stories you write in PI planning are the commitments. SAFE's very clear that they're not. Right? SAFE is incredibly clear that the objectives are the commitments. The stories that you generate in PI planning are just your current belief as to the best path to reach the commitments.
Yes.
And I will argue that if a week after PI planning you rip up all the stories because you've found a better way to meet your objectives, that's living by SAFE canon. Because it's within the power of the product owner and the team to change their team backlog. Right? The control point they've got around adaptability is you have delegated authority within the guardrail of your committed objectives. if you want to change the backlog such that your objectives would be affected, at that point you've got an escalation point. But wow, I've met a lot of people who think, oh, the stories are the commitments.
But doesn't that mean, Mark, that you're talking escalation and stuff like that? I would like to replace that. And if I'm looking to your stick, prepared and present business owners, also prepared and present PMs and teams, let's have a briefing dialogue that is really a dialogue and not a presentation of business owners and PMs. And then some planning context. And now 3 to 4 hours, let's break it down into content, right? Into stories.
Yep.
And I would happily leave a PI planning without any broken down features if the people understood what's behind those features, what is the intent, and do we know it's the right stuff to put into our work for the next 8 to 12 weeks or whatever cadence you have. And then you can say, like Mike Tyson, I go into the ring, I fight, I know my goal. No matter what happens, how the fight evolves over time, I can change immediately. And I don't need a PI planning for that reason. What I need is a dialogue, which should happen in 2 to 3 steps, 1 to 2 probably in preparation time, and a thorough one over 1 to 2 days with the teams that create now this agile release train, right? Or this team of agile teams. And that would create a total different agenda, less focus on having stories and loaded iterations, more about what is feasibility, what are our options, because we talk about set-based approach. Our PI plannings are point-based approaches. I haven't seen many trains coming out of the 2 days with a few options in their pockets. If something changes, you just change, right? And that's for me something that shows they probably haven't been taught the right way, and the coaching wasn't that good over those 2 days.
I mean, I think there are a couple of things at play here. One is I agree the canonical guidance doesn't talk about committing to stories. It does talk about committing to objectives. The problem is that people are people, and once they spend the energy working on stories and figuring out all of those details, there's the illusion of accuracy, the illusion of predictability, the illusion of knowledge. And it's very hard to take that away from them and then go back to, we just use that as an exercise to align around outcomes. So I think there's a problem with the fact that, we go there. With that in mind, there's this constant struggle of what PI planning is. Is it about aligning on intent, or is it about creating predictability? If we do need to create predictability, if that's the expectation by our business stakeholders, by the agilists, then we might need to break story, features into stories and use all that program dependency board to understand what's possible, not possible, and have that illusion that we kind of know what we can commit to, what's uncommitted, and through enough uncommitted stuff, maybe we can actually commit to some things. I guess the question is, are we doing enough as practitioners to explore with each agile release train that we're working with? Do you really need that level of predictability? Is it worthwhile for you to spend the time on that? Or do you actually need more to align on intent and preserve options? And that would drive a different style of PI planning. Again, the agenda, I think, is more or less the same. The inputs and outputs, they're fine. But God is in the details. And I don't think we're having these conversations. Not often enough.
So I'm going to come back to the question to me of, is that the canon or the interpretation, right? And absolutely hear you, and I've seen it, right? I've walked into look at in-flight PI plannings, and I've shuddered. Right, I've walked into PI plannings where all the stories have been pre-printed on index cards to be socialized with the teams, and I've shuddered. None of that is what SAFE is recommending. It's how people are misusing it. And to me, that's the expectation on the coaches or the SPCs to frame the expectation, right? Does anything in SAFE stop you walking out of a PI planning with a set-based option? No, in actual fact, SAFE goes, you should use set-based design. And one
Yeah.
of the reasons that we use objectives is to leave you freedom to experiment with the best way to reach the outcome, right? The fact that somebody has interpreted and maybe the SPC supporting them have interpreted it as something different is not the fault of the SAFE recommendation.
I would say it is, to be honest. I
Me
would
too.
say
Me too,
that
Mark.
I would say that if it was a rare occasion, yes. But if we go out there to the wild, my sense is that the much more common thing we'll find out there is the PI planning that doesn't really follow the SAFE principles, but follows the project mindset, work breakdown structure. And that is on us. We can't just hide behind the fact that people misread the article, or there's also the SAFE principles on the SAFE side. So don't just read the PI planning article. Also make sure that you keep in mind the SAFE principles. I think it's on us to to push for changing the framework so that it doesn't lend itself to this abuse.
Agreed, Yuval. And coming back to your question, Mark, is it canonical or is it the interpretation? It's both, right? If you look at implementing SAFE courses, I'm still not happy with that course because it really doesn't address those issues. So that an SPC after 4 days, if he successfully passes the certification, has had at least 4 days of thorough discussions and guidance through the material to address those issues. What is a good structure, canonical? What is interpretation based on those SAFE principles, right?
Do we even have time in the implementing SAFE class to have this sort of conversation? No. We just walk them through the project mindset PI planning and move along, right?
Then
So
let's change this one. Otherwise, you have the false foundation for those who we address now that they are in charge, coaching and helping the team of agile teams or those teams to come up with a really meaningful PI planning with the right outcomes, not output. Output is just something you need probably to be able to work, but what's the real outcome that we are after?
So I'm just creating a parking lot for us because we're playing around,
Perfect.
right? So we parked earlier,
Yep.
PI planning for non-arts, discussion for another day.
Yep.
I'm going to suggest we park education and others on education of SPCs and others on PI planning.
Yep.
Because I think that's a very long topic in and of itself.
Yep.
I'm going to try and drag us back to minimum. So far we've got a real art, prepared and present business owners, feature breakdown, and alignment to SAFE principles. And I caught some notes around feature breakdown, which it felt like kind of captured the thread of the conversation. So to sufficient level to validate viability and expectation, to sufficient level to agree team-to-team promises, otherwise known as dependencies. I like to use the word promises when I teach it. To surface trade-offs, and to sufficient level to clarify expectations. Does that
And
sit
I
with
think
you in
there's
terms of
something
level?
else that we Yeah, I would add to this, as part of preparing for PI planning, there should be a conversation about what's that sufficient level in light of our business context, solution context, whatever. Like,
Exactly, Yuval.
how
Yeah.
important is predictability to us versus how important is agility and keeping options open?
Yeah, and most arts or team of agile teams I've seen, Yuval, they are just going from PI to PI, understanding a roadmap, which should be part of this context and the intent as well of each PI, because sometimes you're working on something that is over 2 to 3 PIs, right? Sometimes you are in smaller cadences, you're more into life cycle topics, stuff like that. If it's innovation, you're not jumping from PI to PI. You probably need a clear intent and a clarifying dialogue between business owners, content authorities, the teams, to really understand how do we then break down features. Because it might be that if I understand the intent, I would go back during the breakout sessions to my PMs and say, guys, we have the wrong features here. I heard you this morning, I heard the business owners, but these features are not representing what we probably should achieve. And there's something missing between the intent and the feature creation for me as well.
So,
That's a prerequisite, which then leads to probably a better PI planning and a better flow through PI planning as well.
so just checking in that I've caught that. So I caught under prepared and present business owners agreement on the predictability versus emergent expectations.
Yep.
And then from you, Stephan, I heard they're solving problems suitable for an art. Right.
Yep.
And this is,
Exactly.
i.e., not highly emergent. Right. If you know the goalposts are going to shift every 2 weeks as you learn because you're at that stage of life for your solution,
Mhm.
then an art or a PI planning is almost always the wrong answer.
Exactly.
And I know I've worked with clients where they had real incubator products. You'd never go to art level scale on an incubator product. They'd have 1 or 2 teams, maybe 3. They'd run them incubation style. They'd do nothing that looked like a formal PI planning. They wouldn't assume they're
Yeah.
an art. They were still persistent teams. But what they knew was that they were aligned enough to safe in the other expectations in terms of the language, the roles, some of the terms, that if they found product market fit and had to scale, and that moved from that high emergent to scaling mode, that what they'd then do is they'd build them out to an art and transition to that model as they move from high emergent to slightly more predictable at scale.
Another scenario, I've worked with groups that were innovating, were incubating something, were at a scale where one team was not enough. I'd agree that they couldn't stabilize a plan for an entire PI that didn't make sense for them, but they did work as an agile release train for all other purposes. The style of planning and coordination, that alignment that they needed, was better served through doing an iteration by iteration planning event. So I think we need to, my take is we need to decouple the art from the PI planning. I think some arts, different arts need different styles of PI planning. Some arts shouldn't even do just PI planning. They should, plan more frequently. By the way, even those arts, I think, should do PI planning, but it's PI planning at a higher level. It's the PI planning that talks about objectives, key results we want to achieve, not the, what's going to happen each iteration.
So I'm going to keep coming back to the art separation, right? Because by design, the art is meant to run to an aligned rhythm with a certain degree of predictability. and it's designed to run through PI planning, right? Now, I've got in the back burner a blog post I wrote and never published called Safe Without Arts, right? Because again and again and again, I would see situations of a company who would have 8 teams who are not interdependent at all. You could broaden them up and say they're working in the same space, but all those teams were running very self-sufficiently, right? And you look at that and you go, that scale horizontally, right? But you haven't got any of the interconnections that force you into the type of container that an art comes with, or that would cause you to get value from PI planning, right? Are you still going to need a mid-range planning? Yes. But I really work on a brand separation to go, you know what, PI planning has a certain set of expectations. There will be contexts where we'll choose to do something other than PI planning, right? So that, and this is, I think, one of the things to really bear in mind when you think about tuning like this. And it's one of the things that Dean beat into my head again and again and again for 4 or 5 years before I finally got it, right? Was what scales? When you hyper tune to a particular context, there's a reality that in an organization, a lot of other people in that organization will look in. And we saw this once. We launched a train at a bank. It was the first train for the bank. We made a whole bunch of contextual adaptations, right? And they were right for that train. But then the next 10 trains at the bank all looked over and said, oh, that's how you interpret safe and a train and PI planning for our bank. And they were in different contexts. And they carbon copied the contextual tuning, and you had an issue. And one of the reasons why safe has some of that level of prescription is to go, you've got to have something that scales, and you can come along later and you can contextualize, but there's a period of time when, you know, you're a big company who's suddenly got 40 or 50 trains to worry about, and you need repeatable patterns. Because if you go, oh, you know, you do PR planning, but you make your own mind up about how you do it, you get a whole bunch of people who really should do a classical PR planning choosing to make up their own mind. I will do the version where only the managers make the plan. But I've found when you start to get a little bit more nuanced and you say, actually, when we're thinking about interpretation for a particular set of teams or a particular problem, we're going to define some archetypes and we're going, look, if you are X, then, you know, you're going to choose from the pattern Y, right? So if you're a real train, you're going to choose PR planning. If you're a set of teams with some level of commonality to your mission, low levels of interdependency with each other, then you should do, let's call it big room planning, or, you know, some other term, so that we can then start to set some expectations that scale to recognize the different types of situations people are in, rather than just saying, make your own mind up and hope you've got a good coach.
Yeah, I agree with that. I guess my argument would be that in our God's year of 2023, the base PI planning pattern might look a bit different than, you know, what it was 10 years ago. And I would hope 50 of these bank agile release trains are more towards agility and optionality and rather than predictability. But
So just to acknowledge a comment from Eric, who's listening in chat, he said it'd be fun to craft a pattern guide to those variants. And I just went, oh yeah, we should put that on our backlog somewhere in the on the Discord. That would be a fun collaboration project. But back to your comment, Yuval, you'd hope it would be, but I'll be honest, I'm not all that convinced. I think if you think 10 or 12 years ago, yes, the transition path was usually from waterfall. Today, all the data I see and hear tells me the transition is usually from ad hoc agile.
Mhm.
And as often as not, ad hoc agile is make it up as you go along agile, as opposed to anything that you can scale. And yes, there are places where they've figured out and they've got something good and mature. And at that point, I go, kind of, to be honest, why are you changing if you've figured it out? But everywhere I see ad hoc agile, or what's very popular in Australia, is a mashup of Spotify and Safe and a playbook, where they didn't listen to the year that Spotify spent on the road saying Spotify is not a method or a framework. And they didn't
Yep.
actually do anything except borrow pictures from Safe. And they've rolled it out to 10 or 20,000 people who've all made up their mind about what agile means to them. That's the starting position for an awful lot of Safe
Yeah.
implementations.
And in that environment, do we really need to go in and teach people what are Scrumful, to be extreme, through planning stories, all through the PI? But that's what I'm struggling with. Or when we're quoting project to product, when we're talking about agility, when we take all of the principles, the current way we're equipping organizations to run PI planning is not really helping them go beyond that agile scrum fold that they're in. Is not really driving them towards agility. And I think they still need PI planning. They still need coordination across teams, because they're not in a good spot where they're self-sufficient. But every PI planning that I help run, that I help organize, I struggle more and more with, is this the guidance that makes sense? This all started in January in the 6.0 masterclass, when SAI presented Rebecca presented the flow properties and accelerators. And I basically said, I hope at some point we're gonna use this perspective and look at PI planning through that lens. That's essentially what I want us to start to do. Look at PI planning through the lens of this flow that we're emphasizing.
So I have just added another item to our parking lot, which I really should just call the backlog. Why don't we call this the backlog instead of the parking lot? So that was, how do we get PI planning to drive toward agility instead of maintaining the status quo?
Yeah.
So I want to zoom us back for a minute to why I love PI planning, right? Because I do love PI planning. I love PI planning done well. And I probably don't have quite as many hang-ups with the story thing as you do. But maybe that's because every art I launch, I set the context that says, if you tear all your stories up a week after PI planning, that's okay. It just means you're learning. But I want to get into prepared and present business owners, because to me, prepared and present business owners speaks to why I love PI planning. Right? And I'm going to go, if your business owners don't turn up, right, that's a don't waste your time at PI planning. I love PI planning because it surfaces hard trade-offs, right? In actual fact, for me, the reason that we do PI planning is management review. And if you want to get a piece of the agenda that I always fix very fast, if you look at the default agenda, it says 5 o'clock to 6 o'clock is management review and problem solving. And
Open end.
right, I always set expectations. I say, for the first one, it's going to be 5:30 start, so you can breathe after draft plan review. And set expectations with the business owners. It's going to be a 9 o'clock finish, because I'm going to have to facilitate hard to get us out by 9 o'clock. That's the meat. That's where you go. Those teams have spent the day planning. They've told us all the things that they figured out in their day planning, where they need input, support, or trade-off decisions made. We've had business owners in the room present at the Gemba during the day. Right? It's not a scenario of the teams have given them a bunch of estimates and they don't like the answer and they're saying change the estimates. They've seen the teams trying to creatively find a solution and they can sit there and sweat at it. Right? I just 2 or 3 months ago, probably about 3 months ago now, we had a management review that went till midnight. We had some of the most incredibly intense debate there because the real challenges the teams are facing is so clear and present. And you've got a moment where you've got that collection of business owners who can help them there. And, I set the scene for management review. I go, your job is to make enough decisions and commit to enough actions that when we play it back to the teams tomorrow morning, they're going to feel like they're able to reach a commitment to the plan that represents the best set of strategic trade-offs as you've agreed tonight. And if you don't do management review, if your business owners don't turn up, if you don't have decision makers in your management review, that for me is the golden don't bother with PR planning. You're wasting your time because it's there to enable you to see system level trade-offs. All of the rest of it's kind of window dressing as far as I'm concerned.
Yes.
Exactly.
And I think the question should be, what's the minimum viable level of planning the teams do in order to enable that collaboration, to enable that conversation?
Yeah.
And it might be that they need to go into stories to build that view. It might be.
Hence
But
the
that's
feature
a
birthday.
different way of
Yes.
looking at why are they going into these stories.
Yeah.
I teach it as this is a sandbox exercise to do those, to build those options of what might happen, look at different scenarios so that we can make some decisions around it.
Yeah.
But that's not how PI planning is perceived in the wild.
Which comes back to,
And not because, SAFe is not talking about it this way. SAFe is talking about it this way, but it's robbing so many of the classic people that now go into Agile with the project mindset, robbing them in a way which makes them comfortable to keep doing what they're doing.
which takes us back to our backlog around education, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Because I feel like, for me, one of the biggest regrets that I have about the dysfunction in the Agile community around SAFe is that so many of the most amazing coaches who could have made SAFe implementations amazing have opted out and left the playing field to be held in a pretty hot market for SAFe by a lot of people with very little Agile experience. That's the saddest thing to me, and I don't want to get into accusing or anything else, but I'm just really sad that when we've got so many organizations investing hard in scaled agility down the SAFe path, we're missing so many amazing minds who could have created the kind of outcomes that would be possible with the right interpretation.
A
So-
great question would be why did they leave, right? That could be going on the backlog as well, right?
Yeah.
How do you engage those people? And that's part of the preparation for me as well, right? Coming back to what I said at the beginning, if you don't have a real good big picture, who should be part of the guiding coalition?
Yeah.
So we're talking about minimum for PI planning. It's the environment has to be right as well, right? So addressing delays, addressing senior management, no matter who is a business owner or not, is crucial for me as well.
For me, this is even an item that's outside of this art backlog and more in our portfolio level. Like it's way beyond PI planning.
It is all over.
And it's people not necessarily in the organization. It's the sort of people that prefer to go out there and smear organizations using SAFe and SAI rather than pitch in and help. And make sure that SAFe is more agile year by year.
So if we've got minimum for PI planning, and I'm conscious we're at an hour and 10, so I didn't want to run a huge one, this one. So if we've got a minimum, we've got a real train, we've got prepared and present business owners, supportive of the principles with agreement on predictability versus imagined expectations and a real management review. We've got feature breakdown to sufficient levels to generate the right kind of discussions, both between the teams and between the business owners. General alignment to safe principles in the interpretation of PI planning, and coaching from someone with enough knowledge to understand how to responsibly adapt to context. If I added one more kind of large one, right, it's sufficient preparation in general.
Mm.
It's probably the other bit when people look at the launch and art, right, answer 14 questions on a checklist and go. If I compare the amount of work that I believe is right to plan yourself for, particularly your first PI planning, to what a lot of people do, there's a really big gap. If you're going to put that many people in a room for 2 days to plan, boy, there's a lot of work you've got to do beforehand. And I think a lot of people just don't understand that and can be very misled by a surface read of the slides.
No argument for me. I guess what I hope we'll do next time maybe is, okay, if these are the hard points of PI planning, most of these are hard points, things that are in the minimum viable. Let's be clear on the soft points, on the options. What are some things that people are reading as hard points, what are not? Having a the whole story level conversation is probably the biggest one that I think we need to unpack.
Okay, so we've got the soft points of PI planning. I reckon another thing that's become pretty clear out of this conversation is signs you need to tune your PI planning, or signs it's time.
And there's two aspects when you say tuning before you go into PI planning, based on your environment, your context, your intent. And also, then it comes to moderation, facilitation, and coaching during the PI planning. Twice or three times in my career, I had to adapt immediately on day 1 or day 2 to help people reaching the outcomes, right? And I had an SPC candidate with me, and she said, "You can't change the agenda." I said, "Yes, I will, because it makes sense, right?"
Yep.
Yeah, we need to have management review end of day 1. I said, "No, we have it beginning of day 2, because this and this and that," right? And I think that probably leads then to what Yuval said: soft skills, crucial role, RTE coaching, right?
Yeah.
Our curriculum of trainings is geared towards experienced RTs. Where is the onboarding? Where's the training for those who probably are in a good situation where you have coaches like you, Yuval, and Mark, right, leading them through the first PI planning, so that you co-facilitate stuff like that. What if you don't have that, right?
So
Probably big
so
failure,
so
or a lot of open shit.
I give all my RTEs a 80-page facilitation guide for preparing for PI planning.
Okay.
And then another 80-page guide for facilitating in the moment at PI planning. It literally, and they're both been waiting for an iteration where they're going to come down to probably half that. But that, detailed guidance of what to expect, what to take care of before you walk into the room. Yeah. Other topics. So if you've got the signs of the times, we've got signs it's time to tune your PI planning. Signs you need to pivot at PI planning, and then signs it's time to evolve your PI planning.
Yeah.
So tuning before you begin, fixing while you're in the moment, and then recognizing that you can evolve. So I'm sure this backlog is going to just grow and grow and grow because, somewhere in there we're going to put my PI planning simulation, I'm sure, because I know Yuval wants to see the mural version of it. But that's felt like a fun start.
And we also have those things from the Discord channel.
Oh, we've got, if I just scroll around the screen for a minute, we have many things, but the 5 more, looking at it through the lens of the safe principles, through the perspective of the flow accelerators. I should probably zoom this a little bit more. Applying OKRs to it. I'm with you on the OKRs for PI planning, Yuval, and I've had a number of quite vocal discussions with the framework team on that front. So that feels like a pretty good place to wrap session 1. I think Eric's going to host the next one, probably at a time where I'll be asleep or elsewhere, but if I can join you, I will. Closing words, thoughts, things to tune. What would we do differently? Was it a fun discussion for you guys?
It was a fun, insightful conversation for me, for sure. What I would change, I don't know. Not sure yet.
I'll leave you to post-process. If you come up with thoughts, we've got a channel. Stephan, what about you?
For me, it's a good layout of our brain dumps. It really suits me. It covers all the aspects that are on my mind when it comes to PI planning, preparation, environment, roles, scaling up, stuff like that. I'm happy. That's good. I'm looking forward to some further sessions.
Cool.
Evolving everything. Yeah, perfect.
I had a lot of fun, but I mean, I always enjoy these chats. I think the thing that started to hit me is this is going to wind up being a long series. If you think about scratching the surface and how fast our backlog's growing and all the things in the back of my head that are going to wind up on that backlog, we've been teasing Wolfgang about the fact that he's going to run a 64-part series on large solution.
Crazy.
I wonder how many parts we're going to wind up on PI planning.
Probably a few, right? I'm having a session tomorrow with him, 1 hour, a quick deep dive into solution train and what he's done in the past. So I have a few thoughts about that one as well. So let's see what happens. I'm looking forward to that one, Mark. It will be fun.
Almost as much fun as it's going to be Yuval and Wolfgang talking about solution trains.
Cool. Cool. Yeah, you need some controversy. Otherwise, you're too much in your comfort zone.
Absolutely.
I like that. I really like that.
All right, guys, I'm going to take us to the outro screen. Have a wonderful rest of the day, and I'll see you on Discord.
Thanks.
Thank you. See you guys.
Thank you very much. See you. Bye-bye.
Ciao.
Bye.